Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, both in person, and we have a lot of folks on the live stream. And thank you to our guest speaker, James Barragan, for accepting our invitation to come to campus and share your experience and perspective with our students and our community. So my name is Bee Burak. I'm a 25 studying history and government, and I've also done some work in local state house reporting, so I'm especially excited about today's lecture. And today's program is the Rockefeller Center's Bernard D. Nossiter 47 feature lecture. This lectureship was established in 1994 by the Nossiter brothers, Joshua, Daniel, Adam, and Jonathan, with the help of professors Edward Bradley and Michael Ermath, and the great support of the Rockefeller Center, in honor of Bernard D. Nossiter 47 and his contributions to journalism. The fund supports lectures by Harvard University's Nieman Fellows to be held at Dartmouth College under the auspices of the Rockefeller Center. Bernard D. Nossiter was a reporter for the Washington Post for 24 years. He received his bachelor's degree from Dartmouth in 1947 and a master's in economics from Harvard in 1948. He was a trained economist who became a brilliant success as a journalist and an author. His works and papers are available to read over in Ronner Library, Special Collections Library, for those of you who'd like to know more about him. And now we'll move into talking about today's lecture. So today's speaker, Mr. Barragan, has visited with some of our journalism students earlier today, and he'll now present No Time for Apathy, Why the American Public Must Fully Engage in Democracy. Following his talk, Mr. Barragan will be joined in conversation by Professor Jennifer Jerit, the Douglas A. Donahue Jr. 1973 Distinguished Professor in the Government Department. When we get to the Q&A portion of our program, we'll have a microphone available for our in-person audience to come up with questions. And if you're joining us remotely on the live stream, please submit your questions by emailing rockyqa@dartmouth.edu. Again, that's rockyqa@dartmouth.edu. And lastly, for some brief background on today's speaker, James Barragan is a politics reporter for the Texas Tribune, which is an independent nonprofit news organization covering state politics and government. As a Nieman Fellow at Harvard, James has studied democratic backsliding abroad and applied those measurements to the current political climate that we're experiencing here in the US. He's also studied ways to reverse democratic backsliding through social mobilization, policy, and art. Prior to joining the Texas Tribune, James worked as a State House reporter for the Dallas Morning News and also worked at the Austin American-Statesman and the Los Angeles Times. In 2021, James was a finalist for the Toner Prize for Excellence in Local Reporting for his coverage of Texas politics during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as a Southern California native, he received his bachelor's degree in history from UCLA, and he's now based in Austin. So please join me in welcoming James Barragan to the stage.
Thank you, Bee, for that warm welcome. Good evening. I'd like to begin by extending my gratitude to all of you for the invitation to speak here. Thank you to Dartmouth College, the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center, and the Nossiter family. I'm honored to give this lecture named after a prominent and accomplished journalist and hope to live up to his legacy. I want to start off by saying that what I'm about to share with you all are my thoughts and my thoughts alone, based on my study and experiences during this year at Harvard, and they do not reflect the views of my employer, only mine. Still, I hope these words will give some insight into the current state of American democracy and provide some hope and practical steps for those who aim to preserve it. I don't come to deliver a message of doom and gloom. I believe too many in the press are already doing that. But I do want to bring a message of urgency and a call for the American public, particularly young people, to become more engaged in the democratic process that we cherish so much. 2024 is a massive election year. 64 countries around the world will hold national elections. Nearly 49% of the globe's population will be voting in elections this year. That's a massive accomplishment for global democracy. At the same time, we're seeing major democratic backsliding in many places around the globe, including Hungary, Turkey, and India, formerly considered the largest democracy in the world. But my argument this year is that Americans must put a stronger focus on the democratic backsliding that we are seeing here at home, and we have to act to reverse it. The challenges that face global democracy are real and threatening, and we should take them very seriously. But we cannot look outwardly only, criticizing the scapegoating of minorities by other world leaders and calling out their unfair judicial and electoral systems without taking a look at our very own. As the world's oldest and most stable democracy, the United States holds special sway in the international community. When other countries see our traditions of peaceful transitions of power, free and fair elections, adoption of new Americans into our society, respect for differing political opinions, and protection of speech that is critical of government, they believe that democracy can work because we have proven for nearly 250 years that it does. But when the United States begins to fall into chaos because candidates don't want to accept the results of an election, call into question the electoral process, and begin to crack down on critical speech, democracies around the world suffer with us, and authoritarians use that as fodder to attack democratic systems of government. At many levels, we have seen a slow erosion of democracy in the United States over the last decade and a half. Many people like to point to the 2016 election of President Donald Trump as the start of this deterioration, but I believe the regression had started before then. Trump's election was an effect of that erosion, not the cause. And even as Trump has been out of office the last 3 years, the concerning symptoms of a fracturing democracy remain. We see this all too often at the local level, which doesn't get as much attention as big national news. For example, much has been said about Trump's attempt to pressure Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, to find enough votes in the state to alter the result of the election in favor of Trump in 2020. But much less is said about similar attacks on election administrators at the local level. In my home state of Texas, local election administrators say they are under attack by right-wing activists who are dangerously misinformed about how elections work and want to pressure them to implement policies that would favor their candidates. 2 summers ago, the entire election staff of Gillespie County, 80 miles west of Austin, was driven to quit because of such pressure on their work. And elected officials in both Democratic and Republican strongholds have been driven to resign because of concerted attacks on their credibility. In Hood County, near Fort Worth, Elections Administrator Michelle Carew was forced to resign in October 2021 after she was accused of a liberal bias in a GOP stronghold. Carew was a Republican, and Trump had won 81% of the vote in the county in 2020. Still, she was not spared. In my own experience as a journalist, I've seen politicians increasingly unwilling to engage in honest political debate about policies they favor. For the first time in many decades, journalists have been banned from the floor of the Texas Senate, where we could ask questions of elected officials. While we are still allowed in the Texas House, the atmosphere is becoming increasingly restrictive. Governor Greg Abbott, recently named one of the 100 most influential people in the country by Time magazine, barely sits down with reporters and editorial boards from the state's largest papers, preferring to do short TV hits and podcast appearances on friendly outlets. None of these things are good for democracy, which requires free and open debate of ideas. In its Freedom in the World survey, Freedom House, which researches and advocates for democracy around the globe, has found a significant drop in the United States aggregate score for political and civil liberties, from a 94 in 2010 to an 83 in 2024. So that's the bad news. Our beloved country has seen a steep fall in its ability to deliver civil and political rights to all in recent years. Even more concerning, social scientists have found that once countries go too far down the road into what they call autocratization, the fatality rate of democracies is high, 77%. Only slightly more than 1 in 5 countries whose democracies have significantly regressed are able to avert a complete breakdown. So the danger is real. But here's the good news. Because we enjoyed such a high level of freedom to begin with, even a tumultuous moment in history like our own, in which Freedom House records an 11-point drop in our democracy score, still puts us at an 83, a level far higher than many other places on the globe, and in which we can still proudly and correctly claim to be a functioning democracy. It's one with significant warts and challenges, to be sure, but it's a democracy nonetheless. My message to you today is it's a democracy we must actively engage in and defend. Despite what all the doomsayers are clucking, we are not past the point of no return. But given the high fatality rate of democracies that backslide, nearly 4 in 5, this may just be the moment to act. We have to defend our democracy from foreign actors who are undoubtedly trying to interfere and sow division between us, from moneyed interests who don't represent the needs of the general public, and from those within who, consciously or not, would usurp the levers of political power to take us down an autocratic road. I don't mean to be Pollyannish about this, but perhaps a bit of my story may help you understand why I'm so bullish on American democracy. My parents came to this country aged 17 and 20, escaping crippling poverty in Mexico, and a regime that was a democracy in name only. One party ruled that country for more than 70 years, and it allowed the elite and business class to profit off the country's riches, while working class people suffered. The game was fixed in Mexico. Only one party, the PRI, ever had a real shot at winning presidential elections until the turn of the 21st century. The press, dominated by major corporations which were tied to the PRI, were all but a mouthpiece for the government. My parents came to this country dreaming of a place where they could have better economic opportunities and where democracy thrived and was extended even to new citizens, where they could make their voice heard and choose between candidates who offered differing ideas of where the nation should go. They applied for permanent residence in the 1980s and became U.S. citizens in 1996. They voted in every election since. They frequently volunteered for local elected officials and hung campaign posters outside our yard. Their belief in American democracy led them to leave their home country and everyone they knew for the chance of having a say in how their government should be run. Now, they are near retirement and are the owners of 2 homes, the parents of 2 college graduates, and very proud Americans. One of their children practices the First Amendment every single day as his career. This country has delivered on its promises of opportunity and freedom for my parents. And they're not the only ones. Across this country, there are millions of families like my own, whether they came here in the 18th, 19th, 20th, or 21st century. And across the globe, there continue to be millions more families yearning to be here, to be part of this democracy that our cynical and derisive culture often takes for granted. We have what much of the world would die for, and we cannot squander that. We must be engaged in a more robust participation in our democracy that is worthy of the many people who have sacrificed so that we could enjoy it. Particularly in this important election year, we must be actively engaged, not against a party or a candidate, but for our democratic values. This all seems a lofty goal, I know. So here are some steps to consider how we can bring this about. Number 1, do not give in to apathy. We live in cynical times. 24/7 cable, algorithms, media new and old telling us that politics are dirty, that government is bad, that perhaps democracy isn't the best idea after all. That's nonsense. Is our democracy ideal? No. but I believe we can still push for change we really believe in. It's not easy, and sometimes it takes more than one election cycle. But in order to do so, we cannot give in to apathy. We must continue to push. Really think about the last time that you've actively engaged in democracy. I don't just mean voting, which is the bare minimum we should expect of each other. Outside of casting your vote at the ballot box, what have you done to push our democracy forward? Have you registered voters, canvassed for a cause you believed in, lobbied your elected officials, advocated for greater civil liberties for others, thought about running for political office? Democracy is not easy, and it's not supposed to be. It's a battle of ideas, and we should be debating with one another in a heated but respectful way about the best path forward. It's a constant struggle, and sometimes it's frustrating, but that's a feature and not a bug. Our fight is to continue that struggle for a better democracy every day, and we cannot do that if we let apathy take over. Number 2, stop thinking of politicians as elected leaders and begin thinking of them as elected officials or representatives. When we see politicians as our leaders, it is easier for us to give up our control over decision making and defer to them, defer to whatever they, or more often their highly paid strategists, come up with. This allows us to check out of politics and just to follow what our leaders say we ought to be doing. What is the best policy on abortion or immigration, housing asylum seekers, reducing the number of people in our jails, educating our children? These are no doubt difficult questions that require input from an engaged citizenry. To do this, we need to recalibrate our relationship with politicians. Just think about the way our democracy is set up. At the federal level, our elected officials serve 2, 4, and 6-year terms. Every time their term is up, they have to come to our neighborhoods and our towns for our support to remain in their job. We are the ones who give them approval to do their job. They are not our leaders, they are our representatives. And no matter how ambitious these folks are, they are only willing to go as far as the electorate will let them. Right now, it seems to me that they are setting the tone, with appearances on cable news and strong voter outreach through emails and texts. For far too long, we've let them tell us where they're going to take us. We have to flip the power dynamic back toward the people and ensure that they are listening to us, to the solutions that we want to see. This will mean showing up at the ballot box to vote, but also showing up at town halls to make your voice heard and express your discontent. It could also mean joining an organized group to advocate for a cause that needs more attention from public officials. Politicians fear public pressure, and they certainly aren't facing enough of it right now. Until they do, they will continue to think they are our leaders instead of our representatives. Number 3, reaffirm institutions and norms. Professor Stephen Levitsky, author of How Democracies Die, whose classes I've attended this semester, argues that political institutions and norms play a crucial role in maintaining democracies and staving off authoritarians. Things like long-standing political parties and political traditions, but also codified practices like the separation of church and state and the separation of the 3 branches of government. We must affirm these institutions and norms because they are the strongest tool we have against authoritarianism. For example, we should rebuke populist elected officials with authoritarian tendencies who criticize unelected judges for striking down laws that are deemed unconstitutional. The implication is that the elected executive office holder has more power than the judicial branch. But the fact that the judges are unelected is exactly how our system works. They were designed to be unelected so they could examine the law objectively without having to bend to the political pressures of the moment. Those are the rules of the game, and we cannot allow politicians to criticize them just because they did not get their desired outcome. We should rebuke politicians who use that kind of language and who don't accept checks on their power. But we should also strive to maintain uncodified norms that are just as important. In this year's primary season, the presumptive Republican presidential nominee refused to debate his fellow candidates, breaking decades of traditions as he had done previously in refusing to release his tax returns. That deprived the American public of the opportunity to compare and contrast ideas and to see how he matched up against other candidates. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden has broken from a long-standing tradition of doing White House press conferences. That is also bad for democracy because it does not allow the populace to hear what the president thinks about some of the major issues of the day. Both of these examples take valuable information away from a public trying to make difficult decisions and concentrate power in the hands of the few. And they would not have happened if we as a people had reaffirmed institutions and norms. Number 4, support the free press. Here's where some of the self-interest comes in, so bear with me, because I am a journalist. We've got to support a free press, support their right to exist, to publish critical stories, and to hold power to account. Make sure that your news outlet is not just telling you what you want to hear, but what you must hear in order to make good decisions. If your news organization has not made you question your thoughts and beliefs on any difficult subjects, they are not doing their job. Write to them and demand that they do better. News outlets are far from perfect, but in a well-functioning democracy, they play a crucial role. A free press can only exist because there is a democracy. It is a clear sign that democratic values remain in a society. But it's also a canary in the coal mine. Once news outlets start censoring themselves, whether for fear of reprisal by politicians or because it would be too expensive to give voice to unpopular opinions, you are starting a descent into authoritarianism. So support news outlets by defending them against political attacks, but also by supporting their work through subscriptions that will allow them to continue their work independent of government or political influence. Number 5, respect the political viewpoints of others. Earlier this year, Archon Fung, a renowned political scientist at Harvard, ran a social experiment on us at the 85th anniversary celebration of the Nieman Foundation. In a room full of journalists, he asked us to think of 2 or 3 topics that we considered extremely important to us. Things like climate change, abortion, voting rights. Then, Fung asked us if we'd be willing to accept it if a referenda on those issues lost in the next election cycle. More than half of the respondents said they would be unwilling to compromise on any of those issues. Fung then dropped the hammer on us. If you would be unwilling to compromise on any of these issues, he said, then you might just be an authoritarian rather than a small d Democrat. The lesson was clear. If we, the people, are unwilling to compromise and accept electoral losses, how do we expect our elected officials to do the same? We have to set the tone. For democracy to thrive, we have to believe that the democratic process will give us another swing at the ball in a few short years. We have to be able to deal with short-term electoral losses to protect the long-term survival of our democracy. We have to respect each other's viewpoints and understand that we are a nation of many different perspectives. We can disagree vehemently with others, but we must respect their right to believe what they want. If we are convinced of the moral superiority of our arguments, then we have to believe that such an argument will win out in the long run. Number 6, the final one, we have to rebuke the vilification of political opponents. Criticism of political opponents or of the status quo is necessary for change in any democratic country. But we must not let that criticism veer into vilification or dehumanization of political opponents. Those are tools too often used by authoritarians in an effort to eliminate opponents who provide the important role of being a check on their power. We must ask better of our politicians. We cannot tolerate language that fans the flames of hatred by saying that political opponents hate America, want to destroy our way of life, or don't care about your families. In almost all cases, those statements are simply not true. but they are easy tools for populist and authoritarian figures. We must rebuke our politicians when they resort to this kind of language and ask that instead they discuss how their plans for our country are better than their opponents. Any language calling for political violence against opponents must be disqualifying. We must make our voices loud and clear whenever candidates, even potentially our preferred candidates, begin to voice these opinions. Violence must always, always, always be off the table. So there we are. A few tips on how to re-engage with our democracy at a crucial time in our history. I've covered politics long enough to know that these recommendations seem idealistic. But in this crucial time, these are the kind of ideas we need. They are the basics of a democracy and a representative government, and we must return to the basics. But what we most need is for people to actively engage in the political process. There have been other times in our country's history when we experienced similar regressions. The period immediately following the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s come to mind. But in those pivotal moments in our history, Americans of all stripes came together and fought for our democracy and for the civil rights and liberties that we continue to enjoy today. In fact, some of those hard-earned victories are currently on the line as we speak. This is the paradox of our democracy, that while we reach new heights, we also must deal with the backlash to some of the progress that we have won. As one of my professors noted, it's the resilience and backsliding of our democracy that happens at the same time. It is up to us to re-engage in our political process and to fight for the democracy we want and believe in. Now is the time, and I urge you to follow in this long tradition in the constant struggle. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate your inspiring remarks, and in fact, they remind me of a quote from Thomas Jefferson, who once wrote that if he had to choose between a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, he would not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter.
Yeah, I know it well.
So a vibrant media system is at the heart of a functioning representative democracy. But I have some questions about your recommendations.
Let's hear it.
So, on your first point, don't give in to the apathy, I was wondering if the media is at least partially responsible or to blame for the public cynicism and disengagement we currently see. And so I'm thinking of well-known journalistic norms such as the focus on conflict, negativity, sensationalism, all of which can make people want to disengage from politics. Moreover, some other norms which on their face seem noble, such as the norm of objectivity, can have unintended consequences in the form of false balance. So I wanted to get your reactions to that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, as I stated in my remarks, I don't think the media is completely blameless. We're not a perfect entity or organization. Obviously, there are some news organizations that subscribe to "if it bleeds, it leads," and conflict-driven stories. So I think that we do have to do a better job in terms of trying to focus on the actual issues, and also in terms of highlighting when stuff does work, because government is not always a source of bad or evil or corruption, even though I cover a lot of accountability and corruption stories. But there are good people in government and doing good work. And I think that news organizations need to highlight that more, because I think that also instills trust in the public that we're not just out to get a politician or we're against one certain side. So we do need to focus on that more, and I think the public wants more of that. So I do think that we are partly to blame for that, and that we can do better. In terms of objectivity, we've had robust debate about this at the Nieman Foundation at Harvard during my fellowship year. some people believe that objectivity is a myth, that you can't be 100% objective in any story. I understand that perspective, but I don't think that I subscribe to a more traditional view of journalism and how it should be practiced. I do believe that objectivity is valuable because it doesn't presuppose that we don't have any thoughts or feelings about something, right? And we don't have any thoughts or feelings about what is best for the public. But it presupposes that we are going into this with an open mind and want to hear from all sides, because I think that's what the public wants. The public doesn't want a reporter or an outlet who is saying they are objective but has already made their mind up. They want them to go into it with that open mind and trying to talk to everyone. Now, there are other outlets who are more, whether they be left-leaning or right-leaning, and they have a clear perspective and viewpoint, and I think that's fine as well, as long as it is very clear where you are coming from. I think there is value to that, but I subscribe to the more traditional objectivity, which is that, we were talking beforehand about the persuadables and how to get the persuadables who really are unsure of what the best possible solution is to a problem. And they don't necessarily care about left or right. They're just trying to figure out what is the best solution for them. And I think if you come at it from a more traditionally objective point of view, you can win those people over, and that's what I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm. So much has changed in the media environment. Are journalists being trained differently today? I mean, are the norms evolving?
Around objectivity?
Or any of the ones I mentioned?
Yeah, I think there certainly is less of a focus on if it bleeds, it leads coverage, that we don't want to focus merely on conflict or bloody gore. Obviously, we don't want to do that. We want to have productive conversation. But we have this conversation every 4 years around presidential elections of let's not cover polls so much, or let's not cover the horse race of it. Let's cover issues and what the people want. And I think different organizations do it to varying levels of success. I think I sometimes fall into the horse race sometimes because you're so in it and it's myopic and you're following these candidates around. But that's why I was saying in my remarks, if that's not what you want, email the reporters and email the outlets because that's, quite frankly, what the editors think you all want. So that's why we're out there doing it. That's why we're assigned to do it. But if you want something different, if there's enough of a drumbeat for people saying, hey, we want something different, we can take that up the flagpole and say, hey, people actually are not into this stuff. Like, let's try to think of a different way to do it. So I think there is that approach. And around objectivity, I think there is a growing conversation about what are the limits of objectivity? Is there value in just putting out your viewpoint and saying, here's my starting point, take it or leave it, and we'll go from there.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So on the point about reaffirming institutions and norms, today I see many young people who are unwilling to work within the system. So there's not a lot of excitement for current power arrangements. And they're instead urging change on a variety of issues through more unconventional methods such as protest. So can these alternative forms of engagement send effective signals to our elected representatives? And I ask because it seems like a slightly different style of engagement than the kind you were invoking in your remarks.
Yeah, I mean, I think protest, I will always support protest. I'm a civil libertarian at heart, so I will always support free speech and critical speech and protest. I think that is a great tool. I guess my concern is when we talk about people wanting to step away from the system and saying, I don't want to be involved in it. I guess what I always ask for, not just with young people, but anybody really, is when you want to advocate or lobby for change, what is the end goal here? So you can protest all you want, but if it never gets into the halls of power for you to actually make the change, then what is the good of the protesting? I'm not saying that protesting isn't important or isn't a worthy cause, but there has to be an end goal. Even, I talked about the civil rights movement, and in the civil rights movement, there were a lot of marches, there were a lot of boycotts, which is a different way to engage in democracy, a more confrontational approach, which some people don't like, but it was clearly a very successful way to bring attention to the cause. But in the civil rights movement, of course, it was all the protest, it was all the boycotting, it was all the messaging, but it also resulted in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And so there has to be that connection from that engagement that we're talking about to what's actually going to make the change. Because I don't want people just out there protesting for protest's sake, which can be great at some times, and it feels cathartic sometimes to protest for protest's sake. But I'm interested in the actual change and engagement with the democratic process.
Mm-hmm. So you were a reporter in California and Texas, which are two very politically distinctive states. I was wondering if you could talk about that, and did you feel the differences, especially once you'd been in both places?
Yeah, I certainly feel the differences. I mean, one's a very blue state and one's a very red state. I will give the caveat that I wasn't covering state politics in California, and so I wasn't exposed to that much of it. But having lived there for 20 plus years, you know, I knew what was going on, and I knew what kinds of policies were successful in California, which is much more left-leaning, much more liberal, much more progressive. And their spending policies as well, fiscally spending, like they spend a lot of money, and their taxation policies are very liberal. In Texas, it's the exact opposite. It's a very of the right. It's much more fiscally tight and socially conservative as well in terms of Second Amendment, guns rights issues, immigration. So it was a little bit of an adjustment for me. But because my main job in political reporting has been in Texas, I feel that I understand the Texas political landscape a little bit more because I've traveled that state, I've talked to people, I've been in the halls of power there, and I can see the sort of disconnect between what the politicians are saying and what the public is actually asking for. And so that's why I was mentioning in my comments, is like, what are they actually doing? Are they doing what you want them to do, or what they sort of think about? But yeah, I think there is definitely a huge contrast between California and Texas. And depending who's in the White House, they play an interesting counterbalance. When Trump was in the White House, California was made themselves out to be a huge counterbalance to the Trump policies in terms of immigration. I think they became a sanctuary state, or were trying to push to be a sanctuary state. And when there's a Democrat in the White House, Texas really takes up that mantle, be it on immigration or abortion. So yes, very, very different, but two very interesting political states, and where some of the most interesting politicians come out of, I think.
What about changes in media ownership? That's another kind of thing that's been happening globally. Have you felt that as you've worked with different news organizations, kind of this global shift in media ownership and more investment companies getting involved in the media landscape?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you an example. I used to work at the Austin American-Statesman, which was owned by the Cox Media Group. It's a family-owned company, and they own several papers across the country, including the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which is their flagship. When the Cox Media Group was running the Austin American-Statesman, people stayed longer. Reporters were able to gain a lot of experience. Sources in the community trusted them and trusted what they said, regardless of how critical it was of elected officials. And they had good, decent benefits and pay. When Cox decided to sell the Austin American-Statesman, first to Gatehouse, which later was bought out by Gannett, that changed. And I was talking to a professor here earlier, and they noted sort of how, even in my shop, our reporters tend to skew younger, much younger. And I think that is because there is a certain threshold of how much reporters get paid when they are owned by companies that aren't necessarily super invested locally. I don't think that's the situation at my media company, which is a nonprofit news site, but we are still only 15 years old. And we've had great growth, we've done great work, and we've been very successful. But I think we are entering like growing pains in terms of like, what's the next step up? How do we keep these long-term reporters like we had at the Austin American-Statesman, like local outlets used to have. The Dallas Morning News, the LA Times still has them because they're very robust. And places like Newsday, which had very robust news staffs and people who had been there for a really long time. I think that's a concern of mine. And we're still figuring out, I think, the nonprofit news model. And now that there's more nonprofit news outlets, there's less of a pie for those major capital gifts and donations that those outlets have tended to rely on. So we're going to have to figure that out soon.
Interesting. So this leads into the topic of needing to support a free press. In some ways, I think the situation is even more dire than you let on, because the local news industry is in decline. And so journalists are not just under threat from government and political influence, but the industry is not as vibrant as it once was. It's hard, it's in a weaker position. And then you combine this with declining media trust among the public, and I worry that there's not a critical mass of people who are willing to stand up for a free press. And so do members of your profession sense this lack of trust? Is this something you talk about? Kind of what are your thoughts on that general topic?
Yeah, I think it's a major issue. I think there is a trust crisis in the country, where I think in previous decades you could count on your local newspaper, your local news outlets, and say, okay, these people have been around a while, I trust what they say, even if you didn't always agree with them. But I think we were talking about this yesterday, you know, as local outlets have disappeared throughout the country, that has led, I mean, there are studies that show this, right? That it leads to more corruption in local governments. It leads to more spending by local governments, which is untracked because there's nobody watching them. And so it's bad for democracy. And so we do need to, I think the press has to re-engage with the public and figure out how to regain their trust or keep their trust and be more proactive about that, because there are, without question, there's a lot of critics, and sometimes rightfully so, about the coverage that we do. But I think that we need to proactively be saying, here's how we're funded, here's how we make money, here's how that money does or does not impact, in our case it does not impact the coverage that we do. We need to re-engage, re-educate, like really get in the trenches with people and say, we are somewhere that you can trust. But the other thing is just really a business question. And I was mentioning to you before we came on stage that during my time at Harvard, I've sort of been thinking about, I love political journalism. I think it's great. But I do see a missing piece here, which is people who understand journalism on the business side of journalism, because we just have people on the business side of journalism that are coming from other industries. They don't necessarily know how it works. They don't understand the ins and outs. And I think that's sometimes detrimental. And I think that's where we've seen a lot of like cost cutting at local papers, because they're not necessarily invested in the local area that they're working in, and because they just are worried about the bottom line and making a profit. Whereas places like mine, which is a nonprofit news organization, we are invested in our home state of Texas, and we've got to figure out how the business model will work.
Yeah, we're fortunate enough to have a very robust local newspaper here, the Valley News. So kind of in the spirit of supporting a free press, get a subscription if you don't already.
Go subscribe.
So now this is a great time to take some questions from the audience. There's a microphone here, so if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and somebody will come by with a microphone. And then for viewers, you can submit your question to rockyqa@dartmouth.edu. I think there's a question right here.
Yeah, thank you. I was inspired by what you had to say. I mean, we seem to live in a time of the politics of contempt. And in fact, I'm trying to write a book called Beyond the Politics of Contempt, and you know, demonizing political opponents. This is why I've been involved with a group called Braver Angels, which is trying to work on this nationally. And you know, we've offered to come up to offer our college debate program here at the university if people want to take us up on that. But thank you for that. And I think that last point you made about rebuking people who vilify your political opponents, I think that really speaks to that point. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to give credit to Professor Levitsky. If he hears this, that's his idea, and I've been fortunate to work with him. But yeah, he really stressed that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Others? Mm-hmm. Oh, let's get you the mic.
Thank you. I have to believe that if democracy is backsliding, that there has to be a fairly large segment of the population who agrees with it. What is driving people to embrace a backsliding of democracy?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I'm not fully prepared to answer. But you're saying if it's backsliding, it's because there are people who support the backsliding of democracy. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is what that social experiment that Professor Fung did on us shows, which is that we are so tied to our issues that we are unwilling to compromise at all on any of the issues. I mean, it's partially what we saw on January 6th, right? These people believed that the election was stolen because one person told them that it was stolen, and they were driven down that rabbit hole, right? And we have to be able to accept, like I said in my remarks, that we are going to have short-term losses in a democracy, right? And we'll get another swing at the ball in a few short years. That doesn't seem to be happening right now, and I think there's debate about why that's happening. We can say social media, we can say the rise of, talk show hosts like, talk show hosts on the right or the left. I don't think that there's one answer, but I think you're right that we are becoming a populace that does seem to say, I want my side to win at all times. And that's what leads to that democratic backsliding. And Professor Jerit and I were talking before this, and it is like we have to look in the mirror and say, is it me? Is it us? Are we allowing elected officials to take us down these roads because we are unwilling to compromise? It's not a fully clear answer, but I think it's something that we need to start thinking about. Does that make sense?
With the polarization today, maybe the stakes feel so high that people feel
I think that's correct.
It's harder to lose, it's more painful. I don't know.
And the issues are so, they're so high stakes. I mean, if we talk about abortion, it's so high stakes. Voting rights is so high stakes. Even things like climate change, right? They're high stakes. And it's hard for us, I think, to reason and say, well, I'll get another shot in a few short years because the issues are so close and so personal to us. But in his work, Professor Levitsky has shown that in countries where they were able to avert democratic backsliding or a full autocratization, it was because particularly political parties held the line and said, we are not going to go full bear and we're not going to revolt against the system. We're going to have our trust in the system and trust that we will come back into power if our ideas are good enough. Like in Argentina, Peronists who have dominated politics there were out of power for many, many years, and they refused to go full bear and came back and eventually came back to power. So we have to sort of keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm. Other questions from the audience? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think we'll get.
James, thanks so much for your comments. This issue of objectivity is a tricky one, I think.
Yes.
This idea that there's just two sides to a story, you weight them equally, and that somehow you come out to some truth because you've balanced left and right or Republican and Democrat. But that's increasing. I'm not sure that was ever really true. There are as many sides to a story as there are people who see it. It's this whole Rashomon thing, which you can never really get a sense of anything close to the truth unless you interview and talk with everyone who's affected by it. Yeah. And I think also, is objectivity halfway between the truth and a lie? If one side is lying, whether they're doing that purposely or because they've been misinformed. Do you weight that equally with someone who's telling you what is actually going on? And are you doing a disservice to the truth by weighing a lie and the truth, as close as we can get to it, equally?
Yes, it's a very tricky point, and thanks for that question. For me, for example, one of the issues that is very near and dear to my heart is voting rights, right? Because people who look like me didn't always have access to voting rights. And because of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, we do have access, even though those rights have been eroded, quite frankly, in the last decade, since the Shelby County decision in 2013. So for me, voting rights is one of those questions where we can still go ask the questions of the people imposing these sort of draconian policies that make it harder for people to vote, right? We can still go ask the questions. Why are they doing it? And they may be truthful or they may not be truthful. We have to take them at their word about why they say they're doing it, to restrict voting fraud or mail voting leads to fraud. You know, those are the reasons that they say. But I think we can also be very clear, and it is an objective statement to say that those policies do limit access to people of color and to low-income people, and that those are the voting blocs that tend to vote against the people who are implementing those policies. So it's tricky because you don't want to feed into sort of the stated reasons for what they're doing without also illustrating the actual impacts of those policies. And I think it's fair, you've read some of my reporting, and I think it's fair to say these are the stated reasons, this is what actually will happen and what has, because we can say that it has happened in other states where those policies have been implemented. But some people are not willing to do that. I am quite comfortable doing that because I think that still is a statement of fact and it's still objective. And if you all want to see that kind of work, I urge you to, again, send feedback to your reporters and editors and local outlets.
Another area where this happens is discussion of climate change.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, climate change is another one where the science is pretty clear that it's a man-made, it's caused by man, and there's politicians who say, well, we think the science is unclear. Where is the science unclear? Not really, but you know, they're allowed to believe what they want to believe. But we as objective journalists also, I think it would be a fair statement to say that the science disproves their opinions and beliefs. And it's fine to state that. Like, that is their opinion, that is their belief. It is an uninformed belief. It does not live in the truth and it's not fact. But they're allowed to believe that and say that. But we are also allowed to state the objective facts, which is that a wide majority of scientists believe that climate change is man-made. Full stop.
Other questions? Oh, one right here in the front row.
Thanks very much.
This'll be-
Enjoyed the talk. And aptly titled, right? And I like how you gave us 6 points, and you started with apathy as the first one. I think that's really important going into this electoral season. But at various times you've talked about the protest movements, in the past, the J6 folks as well. That really got me thinking, they really had the non-apathy thing down, right? So you can't accuse them of lacking apathy, or they were certainly apathetic, but they didn't have the other features, I guess. And so that made me just think about your framework, and really, I guess it can't be just about one. It's got to proceed through the other ones. And if you thought beyond apathy, is it two? Is it the leadership part? I mean, it strikes me that a lot of those folks really believed in leaders leading rather than a representative model, and same thing with the free press. Like, you could go down the other list. So I was wondering if you've thought about the other 2 through 6, and if you had a ranking of the importance of those as well.
That's so interesting. You're turning it on its head. That's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, look, this is also one of the frustrating things about studying this during my year at Harvard, and also one of the rewarding things during my year at Harvard, which is that I was hoping to come out of this and maybe write a nice little book about all my solutions for how to reverse the erosion of democracy in the United States. What I quickly learned is that it's a complicated subject, and there isn't one answer, right? Just like, to your point, there is no one reason why people are adhering to the idea that we can compromise our democratic values to get our way. Just like that, there's not one reason, right? There's multiple things that are happening. In the same way, to reverse the erosion of our democracy, there's not one silver bullet. It's a list of things that have to be done in a framework, as you're correctly pointing out, and just doing one of them, just protesting, for example, is not going to do the job. It's got to be protesting plus advocacy plus making sure that the politicians are actually putting the legislation into place. And it's a little bit frustrating. And these 6 are not the end-all be-all. There are many more that I haven't thought of, or 6 were just a neat package for the amount of time that we're in here. But yeah, it's not just one thing, and I wouldn't want to put them in order, because I think it's also about the context of the state, the city, the nation that you're in. Which one is more viable for you to do? Which one is more viable as a first step and then a second step? So it's all about context, but you're right, it's not just one thing. We have to do many things together, but we do have to think about it as, how do we protect our democratic ideals? And like, that has to be the big overall umbrella idea that we're chasing after, and then do things to actually achieve that goal. Thank you for the question.
Well, just with the few minutes we have left, I was wondering if you had any words of advice or wisdom for our students, especially those who might be thinking about how to get into your noble profession.
Yes, I definitely encourage it. I encourage you to become journalists. It's a great profession. There used to be this line that it's the life of kings, because you travel, you meet all kinds of interesting people, and it's a fun, exciting job. I think that I have to be realistic that there are financial concerns, and the industry is suffering. But I think that it is a noble career. It's a noble cause. And I was talking to a couple of students here, and I said I was going to give myself 10 years to see how this whole thing worked out, and see if I could do this for a living. And on the 11th year, I got the Nieman Fellowship at Harvard. So it seems like it's working out. I'm going to keep doing it. But I do encourage people to go into it. And if you can't go into it, if you have other passions that are also public service driven, I encourage you to do those. Like, everybody has to put their little grain of sand into this, and still push for like our democratic ideals. And you can still support journalism by subscribing and becoming members to your local outlets.
Thank you. Yes, yes. Becoming politically informed.
Yes.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you for interacting with our students, and thank you all for attending. And,
thank you.
Yes.
This has been great. Thank you so much.
Good night.